wirst ein paar Worte zu SVD4C sagen hier, ne?
Mhm.
Okay, dann sage ich an der Stelle nichts dazu.
Mhm. Okay.
Okay, gut. Kann man auch auf LG.
Here it is.
Yes.
Great.
Good morning, and welcome to STINT Forum today. I'm Andreas Gothenberg, the Executive Director of STINT, and I'm very happy that it has been possible to organize this meeting today as a hybrid meeting with both in-person and online participation. And it's indeed very good to see so many faces here today that I haven't seen in person for 2 years. And today I'm also pleased to present a new study on science diplomacy. The inquiry on increased internationalization of higher education institutions, also known as the internationalization inquiry a few years ago, highlighted the importance of science diplomacy. And in recent years, greater geopolitical tension, increased interfaces between technological developments, the economy, politics and security and foreign policy interests, as well as the pandemic-induced decrease in international mobility, have placed even greater importance on science diplomacy. STINT has therefore identified the need to define and study science diplomacy in Swedish context and tasked 2 leading international experts in the area, Professor Stefan Kuhlman and Dr. EvertAux from the University of Twente, to write a report that sheds light on the definition and development of science diplomacy in the Swedish context, and strategic dimensions and objectives, as well as ongoing activities, initiatives and prospects for development. Professor Stefan Kuhlman is Emeritus Professor of Science, Technology and Society and Chair of the Department of Science, Technology and Policy Studies at the University of Twente. He was Academic Director on the Dutch Graduate Research School in Science, Technology and Modern Culture. Until 2006, he held leading positions at Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovation Research. His studies include research and technological innovation as social and political processes, focusing on governance, and he publishes widely in the field of research and innovation policy studies. Currently, he is a partner of the EU-funded research project S4D4C, using science in diplomacy for addressing global challenges. Dr. Evert Aux is assistant professor in the field of energy transition and transition governance at the Department of Governance and Technology for Sustainability at the University of Twente. In his previous position as postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Science, Technology and Policy Studies at the same university, he participated in the EU-funded research project S4D4C as well. The presentation of the study will be followed by a panel discussion, including Dr. Agneta Blad, Chair for the Inquiry on Increased Internationalization of Higher Education Institutions, Dr. Beate Elend, Desk Officer at the Ministry of Education and Research, and Dr. Hans Christian Hagman, Chief Analyst and Senior Advisor at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. In the panel, we also have Professor Astrid Söderberg Widding, the President of Stockholm University, and also Professor Stefan Kuhlman will participate in the panel. Unfortunately, Magnus Schultz from Wallenberg Foundation is not able to attend today. And the panel will be moderated by STINT's chair of the board, which is Professor Sylvia Schwag-Serger. And once we have finished the panel discussion, there will be opportunity to mingle at the coffee break after the event. And I hope that today's meeting will provide you with an overview of the latest developments in the area of science diplomacy, as it will reflect on the relevant actors and initiatives in Sweden and propose a new strategic direction for science diplomacy in Sweden. With that said, I would like to welcome Professor Stefan Kuhlmann and Dr. Evert Auks on the stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Hi. Thank you very much, Andreas, for this introduction, for opening the meeting. And also, thank you very much for inviting us, Evert and me, to write this little report together with Sylvia, on which we will talk today, dealing with science diplomacy in and for Sweden, as has been said, based on a larger European project that we have been part of, and that will be explained a bit more in a few minutes from now. What we do today in the next 30 minutes or so is to give a short introduction, then define in particular the concept of our understanding of science diplomacy. We'll present you the guiding questions of this little report that we have written and that you have meanwhile, and you have seen it also, it's printed version there. Including the state of the art of science diplomacy as far as we see it. And then we will delve into the STI, Science Knowledge Innovation System, ecosystem of Sweden, the particular situation of Sweden, and the characteristics that lead us then to come up with a couple of recommendations that we want to share with you, what could be considered in the Swedish context to be interesting, to be followed up, and then followed by conclusions. Evert will now define the concepts, present you with the guiding questions and the state of the art, and then I will talk about the Swedish situation afterwards. So Evert, please.
Thank you, Stefan. Okay. So, after the outline, of course, I'm going to have a little bit more content-wise introduction. Vetenskapsdiplomati. It has played an albeit small role in the internationalization report that Agneta Blad has published with her co-authors, well, 2017, 2018. I think that depends on whether it's the English translation or not. What has been a larger term in Sweden, as we've understood from our study, is innovation diplomacy. We might actually touch upon the differences between these notions. Are they there or are they not? Furthermore, Sweden has a tradition of being a norm entrepreneur. A norm entrepreneur is a small country, small or medium-sized countries typically are norm entrepreneurs who try to work on the international stage on propagating certain norms. And Stefan will later on explain a little bit more about that. So as both Andreas and Stefan have already mentioned, we are here because we worked on this S4D4C Horizon 2020 project. And we are actually quite happy today that we can also welcome our project leader in the room because she happened to be in Stockholm today. Elke Dahl from the Center of Social Innovation in Vienna. Yeah, so the project S4D4C started in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, and we had the ambition was to add some empirical research to the relatively small body of scientific knowledge at the time. We did that by executing 9 case studies in very different fields. There was something on cyber diplomacy, we worked on water diplomacy, and to try to find out what then is this strange animal called science diplomacy. Well, many of those results also come back in our report. You can see some of the references in the reference list. Of course, feel free to visit the website as well, where all the publications are mentioned as well. All right, science diplomacy. I promised to talk a little bit about what it is, defining it. So before we start with a definition, or we come up with a definition, we have to see what are we actually talking about. And as we found out during our larger project, we saw that there's, on the left-hand side, a move from club diplomacy, or what's being called club diplomacy in international relations literature, so a kind of exclusive team of people, often from the foreign ministry, working on international relations, to a more networked form, more inclusive. It opens up to more actors. And it kind of goes parallel to what has in the policy literature been called the move from government to governance. So which actors have been added to this diplomacy ecosystem? It's actually the diplomacy community plus STI community, or also policy community. And furthermore, the purposes of this kind of diplomacy have changed. Or at least, yes, they have changed, and they have moved to a kind of range, moving from competition. So currently a hot topic is STI sovereignty, at least in Germany, for example, to collaboration. For example, the climate change negotiations by the United Nations. So taking these observations together, we could come up with a relatively broad definition that's called science diplomacy is collaboration between existing and new stakeholders working in the science, technology, and innovation community, the diplomacy community, and the policy community on different levels in the multi-level spectrum of decision-making within an international politico-scientific context that can be characterized by activities ranging from competition to collaboration. I will return in a minute to a little bit more specific representation of what this could mean from our point of view. But first, what have we done in our study? The guiding questions and the approach. There were two guiding questions. First of all, what are the key issues concerning science diplomacy in the Swedish ecosystem, STI ecosystem at the moment, and which actions could be undertaken to tap into the potential for science diplomacy in the Swedish STI ecosystem. The approach was a qualitative one. We interviewed stakeholders in the Swedish STI ecosystem. Some of them are here today, which is really nice to have a face, or actually a three-dimensional face, with those names. So we had people from the higher education, from Swedish national ministries, from intermediary or funders, private research funders. And the questions that we asked them, or the topics that we covered, were actually about what they already understood science diplomacy to be, whether, and if so, what kind of value they attributed to science diplomacy, what activities they were already involved in that could be called science diplomacy, and whether they would be interested in investing in such a thing as science diplomacy. So, when I cover the state of the art of science diplomacy, I would like to talk first about how we can understand it, or how others understand it, what it means to do science diplomacy, and I want to introduce a normative view as we have captured it. So, when we think about science diplomacy, and maybe also when you think about science diplomacy, the term might be different from the activities, because we are talking about internationalization in higher education, in research collaboration, in international patents, in, well, as I said, climate change negotiations that are very, very much knowledge intensive. But the notion only came up in the 2000s, notably with the institution of the Center for Science Diplomacy in the United States. So there's a difference between the history of the term versus the history of the activities. Since 2008, since around 2008, there have been several attempts to define science diplomacy. So I've picked a couple of them. There might be others, but you can see, and the most interesting thing is that I'm going to touch upon is the orientation that they have. So the first row, which is the very seminal work by the Royal Society from 2010, together with the AAAS, the American Academy of the Advancement of Science. They talked about science diplomacy as three processes or mechanisms: science for diplomacy, diplomacy for science, and science in diplomacy. Then there was a practice fueled view that was talking about science diplomacy as interest-based. So you could distinguish types of science diplomacy based on whether they were national interest-oriented, bilateral-oriented, or multilateral-oriented. And then there was a more interpretive view from colleagues from our project who distinguished certain purposes of science diplomacy. And there's a list of 6 of them. You can also read them in the report. I'm not going to go into detail for them, about them. So what you see is that in the literature, science diplomacy is covered from very different angles. And on the one hand, you could then say, okay, how does this help us? If science hasn't even come up with a definition, how does that help us? Is it then a catch-all phrase? So simply a container concept that we cannot do anything with? Well, we would object to that. Because we think it's what has also been called in the science technology studies a boundary object. And what a boundary object does is that different interpretations of the same thing from various actors, so in this case science, practice, policy, diplomacy, actually produces a productive tension. So you can actually discuss about what does it mean to do science diplomacy? What does science diplomacy mean? What are those activities? So doing science diplomacy, which follows from the previous slide, is actually not that clear-cut as well. So there are some countries that have global networks with posted science diplomats at embassies, at missions. However, scientists themselves can be can carry out science diplomatic activities, as would diplomats that are not officially called science diplomats. As such, and also a contribution from our project, a Spanish colleague who's currently working at the EU in Brussels, he said, okay, you can distinguish institutionalized and non-institutionalized science diplomats. And similarly, you can talk about explicit and implicit science diplomacy, and Stefan will touch upon that as well later, which simply means it can sometimes be advantageous or disadvantageous to talk about doing science diplomacy, presenting what you do as science diplomacy. So what we think is the most important, apart from all those labels, or perhaps the salary that you're paid as a certain position, is that you are literate in both science and diplomacy. So, and literate means you know the ways of both systems very well. So what we came up with is this image. It is not based on mechanisms, it's not based on interests, it's not based on purposes. What we started from is the practices, so the activities that people who could be called science diplomats, what they are doing. So first of all, there's scientific knowledge production. So those are processes, and universities, research centers, they are producing scientific knowledge. And then there are practices of politics empowering, so organizing interactions between countries, but also between actors within a country. And then there's a third sphere of practices that is related to problem deliberation. What are the current problems? What are the current challenges that we need to cover? And with these 3 arenas of practice, there are overlaps, and at the center is what we think, or what we call the science diplomacy interaction space. So when you want to produce interesting, constructive, and productive science diplomacy activities, you need to find that space where these 3 practices come together. And the idea is, why we did this, is that some actors simply are involved in many of those practices. They cannot be put in one box or the other. And then there's the green oval around it, and that kind of positions this view in a kind of realist perspective, this what we call international politico-scientific context. So think about current tensions, geopolitical tensions, think about global challenges that are not so much domestic or national interests, but various challenges. And these come from competing value systems, competing interests and worldviews. So this is the view that we came up with after seeing these different notions and seeing that they don't cover it. And we're not saying that this covers everything, but at least this makes it useful to think about science diplomacy in a procedural way. And Stefan will touch upon more about that.
Yeah, thank you, Evert. So far for the introduction, the conceptualization of what we are thinking about and what we're talking about. Against that background, as Evert said, we did a number of interviews, we studied reports that were available to us about discussions in Sweden and the perspectives of different organizations. And that led us to summarize a couple of characteristics that we thought fit to the picture of Sweden. First of all, science, technology, innovation actors are, compared to other countries, relatively independent from governance, not financially, I would say, but in terms of the discretion that they do have and to take decisions, to develop their own strategies. And also amongst each other. Given the size of the country, there is a relatively large number of relatively independent actors who have to organize amongst themselves and vis-à-vis the government and, of course, vis-à-vis the outside world in the context of science diplomacy. The government itself, the central government, national government, is relatively, comparatively with other countries, light in terms of their organization. I'm not speaking about power, but I'm speaking about the organization, bureaucratic volume, so to say, and degree of involvement in all kinds of nitty-gritty things that are being done by the various actors in the system. So the agencies are important. The agentification of many of the organizations, institutions in the country, in the STI ecosystem, is a typical characteristic for the country. And having said that, Swedish universities and companies, those companies that are involved in research and innovation in particular, they are well embedded in international networks. So they are quite internationally oriented also. That is, I think, a particular characteristic for the Swedish system. Not all smaller countries, actors in that field are that internationally oriented like the Swedish. And there is, Evert was already alluding to that, there's a long tradition and culture of initiating and leading international diplomatic initiative efforts back to, for instance, 1970s Swedish initiative, which led to the UN Conference on the Human Environment. One is a typical example of this norm-entrepreneurial approach that implicitly is around in the country. So having said that, implicit science diplomacy, there's a long-standing tradition, I think, with many of the organizations in Sweden. Implicit because nobody has called, or almost nobody has called it science diplomacy. But de facto, we can, referring to the definitions given by Evert, we could say it is kind of. But there's currently no explicit discourse on science diplomacy. That's one of the reasons why Sylvia and Andreas thought we should have this kind of discussion with you, whether or not it makes sense to have that, to start that kind of discourse. Swedish universities, many of them are quite systematic, structurally involved in international cooperations. For instance, well known, I think, to many of you, the Karolinska Institute, the collaboration with Chinese partners in Hong Kong, also contested currently. As we have heard, the Stockholm School of Economics is quite active in Riga and St. Petersburg. Just to drop two examples here, there are clearly more. There's a number, as I already said, of government agencies active in the field. Important ones are Team Sweden here. INTSAM is very important with the funding agencies collaborating, like Vinnova, for instance, but others as well, the Research Council involved here and also independently. And that holds for many of them. They are, on the one hand, collaborating amongst each other with respect to international collaboration, but they are also bilaterally active. And that provides us with a quite rich and diversified picture. There's a network for innovation diplomacy. run by the Ministry of Enterprise, another interesting activity next to the ones I mentioned. To which degree there is overlap or not is something we could discuss later today. And then there have been efforts in the last couple of years to think about all that in terms of the further internationalization of the Swedish higher education system and broader. Anita Blatz and colleagues' report was already mentioned. It is kind of an indicator of an increasing interest in the subject, in the matter of international collaboration in the country. And also the guidelines provided by STINT on internationalization have become quite prominent and have been well received. So there is attention for the issues, for the questions we talk about. Now, when it comes to recommendations, starting points for us were, first of all, against that background, whatever science diplomacy initiative would be taken in this country, it would not work if it would be designed in a rigid, top-down way, by whomever. Second, a science diplomatic effort would be organized as a kind of an orchestration approach. It would have to acknowledge the different purposes, the different interests of the stakeholders involved here, should not neglect them. And that means what, in the beginning, conceptually speaking, we had mentioned as being one of the strengths or weaknesses of the notion of science diplomacy, being a boundary object, so being something that you can look at from different angles and have different interpretations of, could be used here also as a productive mechanism, not trying to define it to death, the notion, but rather the opposite, leaving it open and just facilitating debate about what it could mean for the participating organizations in a joint effort. And that brings us to our basic suggestion, that is to think about setting up a non-partisan science diplomacy forum in the country, drawing on preceding activities, like, for instance, the platform idea that was put forward in the report by Anita Blatt and others. But that is to be discussed, a forum, as a curated interaction space, meaning it's not just open-ended what you do. It's curated. There is somebody to be, there's an organization or an institution to be defined that takes care of what happens there in the sense of this interaction space as we have defined it before, defined by the practices of those who participate rather than the institutional background of them. And it would then enable and facilitate debates, to the establishment of joint initiatives between the semi-independent Swedish actors around the notion of science diplomacy. And here we suggest to take into account and be guided by a couple of principles that we have developed in our S4D4C project, in what we call there the new protocol for science diplomacy. There's a report, you can download it and read it. In that report, we had suggested a number of these procedural principles, which I will not discuss in detail here: alignment, deliberation, reciprocity, inclusiveness, transparency, sensitivity, legitimacy, and so forth. If you're interested in that concept, please read the report. It is easily accessible. Just to show what we mean, I pick up on deliberation as one of these principles that could be relevant for such a forum, so curated forum. Deliberation, this is picked from that report. This is just a screenshot from the report saying science diplomatic activities could and should encourage mutual understanding of actors' perspectives, their needs, their objectives, the related knowledges that they mobilize amongst each other, put that on the table so that it's visible and understandable for everybody that there are different views of what is at stake. It's a starting point for any productive discussion, and do it in a way that is trustable and transparent. This is just one example here. Next to that, we have also elaborated on a number of infrastructural principles, 3 of them actually here: capabilities, capacities, and trust that can come out of the availability of capabilities and capacities. I pick here again just these two, capacities, capabilities, and our suggestion is to interpret this with the help of the notion of strategic intelligence for science diplomacy. Strategic intelligence is a notion that we have come up with and developed in the context of science and innovation, and policy, already more than 20 years ago, and published a lot about it. I pick it up here for this particular purpose. The idea is that there would be a kind of observatory, the non-partisan observatory, that observes what's happening in the country and worldwide, of course, in relevant fields that think of the practices of the graph we showed, that could be relevant here. And would be collected, would be digested, would be presented to the various stakeholders involved here through a number of science diplomacy advice channels and forum meetings, would lead to capacity building through training of people active in the field. It could help to feed science diplomacy posts around the globe, and could also help to link up with international organizations through kind of brokering. Organizations that do play roles here in furthering the idea of science diplomatic efforts. The graph that you see at the right-hand side is not characterizing the Swedish situation. We have picked it, you see it's 2004, it's quite old, from another report where we had suggested a similar conceptualization. The basic idea is you bring together heterogeneous actors in a defined area, the science, technology, innovation ecosystem, with, for instance, here research organizations, universities, and their different units who do something in terms of international collaboration. You have all kinds of institutions, organizations that play more active with frame conditions, that is ministries, that is oversight organizations, but also research on exactly these things that we talk about here. And they all help to collect and then generate information, strategic intelligence that can be of importance for the actions of all those involved here. So it is a kind of giving and taking approach that we suggest here. And we call it a clearinghouse for such strategic information. So that is something to be discussed and thought about here, whether this is interesting, what actually the scope of activities should be of such a forum for science diplomacy and strategic intelligence provided in an observatory that would be run there, by whom, at which cost. These are open things. We didn't want to anticipate on this. This is something for debate today. So that brings us to this conclusion. If it's true that there is an important and inspiring and enabling legacy of norm entrepreneurial experiences in Sweden, and if it's true that Sweden's institutional diversity in our field here, science, technology, innovation, is diverse, we should not try to talk that away, but rather turn it around and say this is valuable, it's a good starting point. But then, such an interaction space could be very helpful, where people get together, following certain procedural principles that make sure that it does not immediately become a power game amongst these different actors. Rather, it enables productive and constructive interactions there. For that purpose, one needs also information, high-level information that is collected with the help of a clearinghouse and then debated in a curated form and forum with the involved and mentioned stakeholders. So that in the end you could say this curated forum or the organizations which would run that would act as a kind of an honest broker. Trustable, reliable, legitimate, honest broker. So that's more or less what we have elaborated and would now like to discuss with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan and Evert, for this, both for doing the work and for this presentation. I want to ask if there are any questions in the audience before we move into the panel, comments or questions that you would have to the authors. I can also mention that we have around 40 people online, and I would also like to encourage the people online just as much as the people in the room to post their questions. The people online have to post their questions, and the people in the room, please ask your questions, but if you have questions, you need to speak into the microphone. And maybe one thing I forgot is to introduce myself. My name is Sylvia Schwag-Surger. I'm a professor of research policy at the University of Lund, and I'm, as Andreas said, chair of the board of STINT. So are there any immediate questions or comments to the report? While you're thinking, and Andreas will be feeding the checking what comes in online, I think it was, in my mind, and this is the reason we at STINT thought it was a useful exercise to do, it comes at, I think, a quite opportune moment, this report, which is what we're hoping. And you pointed out, I think, 4 areas which I find particularly interesting. One is the distinction between innovation versus science diplomacy, and I'm hoping we can talk more about that in the panel. The notion that Evert brought up about literacy in both science and technology, which I think is a very interesting one. The idea that science diplomacy can be implicit, and it's not necessarily new. But perhaps, and this is another question I hope we can discuss in the panel, perhaps it is now more important than it has been in a long time for various reasons. And then you have put out sort of a suggestion about how to consider a curated discussion on science diplomacy in a Swedish context. So these are the things I take away from your report. And I wanted to ask one question then, if nobody else. There is a question. Please, go ahead.
So, who has a question? I have a microphone to pass over to you.
Thanks very much. Hi, I'm Carl Jedding from Ericsson. And the whole framing for this discussion is, of course, what is Swedish science diplomacy, implying that, there is a national interest or national objective. Is it, to you as an external observer, is it clear what Sweden wants from Swedish science diplomacy? What are the objectives?
It's a very interesting question. Thank you very much. Going back to the interviews that we had with a number of stakeholders, some of them are here, others are not here, the impression is that each of these stakeholders, each of these representatives of their respective organization, university presidents or representatives of companies or funding organizations, so they have their idea of what science diplomatic activities, even though they might not be called like that, for Sweden, not for just an organization, but for Sweden are and could be and should be. But that is not necessarily the same if you ask these different people. So the answer is yes and no at the same time. So we could say that's one of the reasons why we think it is important to have such a forum or interaction space where exactly these expectations, hopes, suggestions, frustrations, whatever it is, might be put on the table, might be debated in order to find common ground and room for joint activities, or also for conscious diversity. That's also possible to say you do that, we do that. Why not? That could be also part of it. So the answer is yes and no.
And I think, Stefan, it also depends. Evert showed very clearly that there are very many different approaches to science diplomacy,
yes.
Right? I mean, you talked at the end about there can be a normative approach, but there's also the one sort of launched by James Wilston in the Royal Academy about, it could just be about increasing science in diplomacy or science for diplomacy. That could be a very fundamental objective. There was another? Yeah, go ahead.
So we have one online question, which is, could you perhaps reflect on the role of Swedish science diplomacy in relation to evolving European science diplomacy?
This is also a very interesting question, because we were asking this, addressing that question in our interviews also. And the observation is that the European discourse on science diplomacy did not play a major role in the perception of the Swedish actors. Only marginally they were talking about it. This is a generally interesting observation, that the European dimension, but I'm always speaking about our field. I mean the field of science, technology, innovation, not other policy domains or so. But in that domain, that the Swedish actors, at least we have come across, for them it's not that prominent. Of course, it's important, it is there, it is acknowledged, but it is not that prominent. And that's an interesting thing, I think, also given this legacy in Sweden that you do have, to link up more with European efforts, European Commission's efforts. Not at least in view of the ongoing global tensions that we are facing in a number of dimensions, whether it's climate change or it's this upcoming worldwide competition between the blocs, and so on and so forth. I think it would be valuable to think more proactively about it, to become involved more with the European discourse, and even take a lead here. Why not at some point? But for now, I think no, there's not much evidence for that.
Mm. Thank you, Stefan. Maybe one more question, if there, go ahead. There's time for more questions. I've just prepared one in case there are no more.
Thank you. I'm Kurt Bratteby from the Swedish Institute, and I was a bit surprised. I wasn't expecting you to come up with the norm entrepreneurial legacy as a starting point. I would never have thought of that myself. That implies, given Sweden's legacy then, and also values-based foreign policy, if you wish, and so on, that how much initiative should come from governance when it comes to defining the direction, because norm entrepreneurial implies that somehow norms are being defined, norms are being formulated and conceptualized. Who should take this initiative? Is the concept of a honest broker meant to be sort of a process implying that this should be debated between actors, or should government take a more proactive role in this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an important question. And there are countries where the answer to that kind of question would be easy, because it's taken for granted that government would take the lead. But our impression was that this is not fitting the Swedish tradition and the self-perception of important actors, institutional actors in the country. So I think our impression was that nobody really expects the government to take the lead in these areas. I mean, there might be others. I speak always about this domain. I have to be careful here. But in this domain, for a number of historical reasons, and I think they will not change. But that still, of course, the question remains: the honest broker, who would that be, and who would frame that institution? Our assumption is that it would be negotiated, could be negotiated between major representatives of these actors that we have sketched, that is these agencies, that is the major higher education institutions, major industrial representatives in the field of science, technology, innovation, and so amongst them, they could identify an institution, an organization that is sufficiently independent and non-partisan, but without own strong stakes, in the sense that they want to get lots of income, or I don't know what, or political attention or so. But that's up for debate, whether this is available and who that should be.
Thank you, Stefan. Another question from...
Yes, we have a question from Ingrid Pettersson, and she's asking, in a global context, how independent is the science in science diplomacy?
Good question. Good question. And historically, we would say that's not only in Sweden. The claim, of course, that science is as independent as possible. But that's the basic idea of modern science, to be independent of governments, of economic interests, of what have you. But we all know that this is that's not the full picture currently for many, many, many reasons. And certainly in some parts of the world where governments very, very, very clearly and dominantly are guiding investments in science, directions of science, careers of science, and controlling scientists, and we know that, and that's unfortunately an increasing phenomenon. So yeah, that's part of the game, I think. That's in science diplomacy. That's one of the reasons why we are refrained from coming up with a substantive definition of what science diplomacy is, rather a procedural one, because we would have to be able to organize internationally debates or exchanges that would not exclude representatives of science systems which are far more controlled, top-down controlled, than, for instance, the Swedish one. That would be not only a pity, but it would be a major mistake, because one would then at some point start to isolate oneself. So, yeah. But yeah, it's part of in short, it's part of life in the meantime, that science is not always independent.
Thank you very much. Evert wants to say, I think it's interesting what you say, Stefan, because then possibly one objective of science diplomacy could be safeguarding the freedom of science in the face of international challenges, international trends.
Probably not safeguarding, but at least stabilizing, or in a way, facilitating, supporting. Yeah.
Evert wanted to say something?
Yes, I would just like to jump in and complement what Stefan has been saying. Of course, Stefan has also been talking about observations, global observations how science and diplomacy are currently relating to each other. There's also, which we also promote, a more normative view. So how should science and diplomacy relate to each other within science diplomacy? And there we think that it only makes sense, and that only works in this curated forum, if both are on eye level and they're honestly treating each other. So that's a normative perspective.
Very important. There is another question over there.
Hi, thank you. My name is Hans Lundin. I'm from KTH. Speaking about Swedish legacy and characteristics of Sweden, my first question is, do you think that Swedish actors that are involved in science diplomacy is emphasizing more on what would be more related to innovation diplomacy? I'm thinking of Sweden as an innovative country, the triple helix, and that actors working together in Sweden might be more focused on innovation diplomacy. And the related question then, that might also relate to the discussion in other countries, like in the European Union, if there is a need to conceptualize and discuss what's the difference between science diplomacy and innovation diplomacy. Might there be a more emphasis on innovation diplomacy in Sweden in comparison to other countries? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is also in our report. We briefly talk about that, and we also came across that question in our interviews. And again, that was representing very much the take that people have on that question depends very much on their own background. And there is a tendency by some actors, organized actors, to emphasize the relative independence of an innovation diplomacy as opposed to a science diplomacy. And others would not accept that, would rather look at this in a very inclusive manner, and that it all belongs together. Again, I think it doesn't make sense, at least from our perspective, to to make too strong definition efforts here. And this is it, this is this. Rather, it's a fact that there are different interests, and not only different interests, but very different activities by companies, by governmental organizations. The Ministry of Enterprise, for instance, in the respective area of trade and innovation, and so, and that is seems to be relatively independent of what universities, for instance, do in their respective field. But I have to be careful, because that may also be a misguided perception, depending on the respective view of those people we have talked to, because they might not be fully aware of what actually their individual member or organization members actually are doing. University is a big animal with all kinds of departments and all kinds of collaborations, international projects. Basic science, highly applied science, both is happening in the same university. Nobody has a full overview who is involved in innovation diplomacy or in innovation-related activities with international partners, which might have some diplomatic aspects, and on the other hand, basic science, basic research activities playing in totally different arenas. So, yeah, this differentiation is there. It is an expression for different purposes, different intentions and interests. And there, in our view, I think this is part of this interaction space. I would not cut it systematically. I would rather bring it further together, because there is so much overlap, potentially.
Thank you. We have one more question.
I was planning, my name is Lena Bruce. I'm head of all of the offices of science and innovation in Sweden. You mentioned us as the innovation diplomats, I guess. And I was waiting, actually I was hoping to wait after the panel, because I don't really grasp the notion of what the major difference between innovations diplomacy and science diplomacy, because we, as a governmental entity, we work for the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Infrastructure, Ministry of Environment, and the Ministry of Enterprise, together with the foreign ministry. So for us, I think our aspects of our grasp is that we are actually doing both. We think that in order for us to really be agile and meet, again, the 2030 norms, we will have to have both basic science together with more mature innovations or more mature policy discussions on how to get innovation into the markets, or how to get, I mean, the green pacing problem, for example. You need to have the basic science to understand climate issues. You need to have research to find solutions, but you also need to have government agencies talking together. How would we set permit procedures? How would we put valuation or incentives in order to get this shift going? And I think that's important, to not really try to separate them, but actually try to get them closer, because otherwise I don't really see how we're going to get this global shift that we need. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Fully agree. That's what I just tried to say in response to your question. Indeed, see it in an integrative manner. Yeah, fully agree.
Yeah, and thank you, Lena, because I think we're getting now into the sort of more the Swedish perspective of the discussion. So I think I have two more questions, one there and one in the back. So if we could do those together, and then I'd like to ask the panel to join me.
I'm Christopher Laurel, and I work for Enride, which is a Swedish tech company. Thank you so much for a brilliant presentation, and I love these ideas on how we can work in the future. I have a question about momentum. I used to work in academia before joining this tech company that is in a very rapid phase. And one of the questions that I get from my former colleagues in academia is what's the major differences, essentially. And what I tell them is that 1 week working for a scale-up that is very vibrant is essentially equaling 1 year of an academic year worth of impressions. So my question is about momentum. If you bring all these actors together and you have actors that need momentum and need speed in order for them to be able to operate, but you also have actors that have a much longer time horizon. How do you sort of match that together? I'm curious about hearing your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting question. If we could take the last one also, and then give Stefan and maybe Eva the chance to respond before.
Yes, morning everyone. My name is Richard King. I work in the UK Science and Innovation Network based out of the British Embassy, and it's really fascinating sitting here and listening to your presentation and sort of comparing to the sort of UK experience. I think the UK Science Innovation Network doesn't actually have that many direct comparators internationally in terms of how we're set up. So it's very interesting, and but a lot of what you say resonates in terms of the Science Innovation Network over the years it's existed has sort of moved around the sort of TRLs, the technology readiness levels quite a lot. We've had a different emphasis on science for diplomacy, diplomacy for science, global challenges and things. So it's sort of, we've moved around quite a lot. And it's obviously different in different places as well, of course. And I think my very good science innovation officer in Sweden has a sort of philosophy of following the value proposition, which is quite an interesting way, because I think once you actually get down to it, the work is there. And that sort of leads on to my second point, which is about your points around sort of the role of government. And I sort of, really hear the points about independence, but I think on a practical level, there is something about having boots on the ground in the embassy, sort of knowing the ecosystems. I feel that here. Sweden's just opened a new science and technology office in London, which we're really delighted by. And of course, we work with organisations like UKRI and Universities UK, and they are independent. But by virtue of us being here, there's things that we can do and we can sort of help them with just by virtue of that intelligence you get. I guess it's a slightly more what's the sort of pragmatic sort of look on what science diplomacy looks like. Thanks.
Thank you. To keep it short, I would like to for both questions actually, I would like to return to the suggestion to come up with a clearinghouse for strategic intelligence. I'm saying that because there are different speeds in such an environment. You have indeed, as you said, the companies needing momentum and speed, and you have long-term collaborations and long-term knowledge development and collaboration and so on and so forth. We cannot compare them in terms of institutional organizational logic. So it's really different. But what can help keep them together, and that also links up partly to what you were saying with respect to pragmatic solutions, is sufficiently broad and well established and analyzed information, knowledge about where do we stand in different knowledge areas, scientific knowledge areas, in different technological domains, in different respect to different interests, political interests, economic interests in different parts of the world. Where are our representatives, in what domain, in what kind of business, so to say, higher education business or company business in different places. You mentioned the UK here, for instance, and you're speaking about for a company here. That if that knowledge would be not just somewhere, and that's what we experienced here. It is there, but it's not connected. You would individually have to collect it in a way and bring it together, depending on your project and your initiative. So if it would be available in a non-partisan way, trustable way, in a strategic intelligence clearinghouse, then that could help the various actors to, on the one hand, follow their own strategies, but at the same time to at least to follow what others in different domains, at different speed, are doing. We should keep it like that. I mean, there are examples, not for science diplomacy, but for latest strategic intelligence in the research and innovation in other countries. If there's time enough later in the discussion, I could give examples from other places where this, to some degree at least, works, this kind of clearinghouse approach as a backbone, so to say, for the interest-driven activities of various actors in the foreground. Different speeds, to pick up on what you said.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thanks a lot for all the questions. And I think it's time now to move to the panel and move more into the Swedish context, the way we perceive the Swedish context, and also what might be ways to explore future pathways. And so I'm very happy to welcome the panel up to the stage. We were supposed to have 5 panelists, but we now have 4. So Agneta Blad, Astrid Söderberg-Widing, Jose Hagman, and Beate Ellen. Please, if you could join me on the stage. And I'm delighted to have an in-person panel. I had decided that I will never do a Zoom panel again. So it's a pleasure to actually be with you in the room.
Death to Zoom.
So I think we should start. And then Stefan will also be part. How about, I'm trying to find
No,
a
I can
safe
stand
game.
here.
Okay.
That's perfect.
So
It's okay.
Stefan is also part of this, so please feel free to, and again, we would like to invite the audience on stage, in the room and also online to pitch in. I would like to maybe start with Agneta. Agneta has been mentioned. She's been in many positions in the Swedish system, as the rector of university, as a state secretary, as the director general of a government agency for higher education, and also, as you have been mentioned, as perhaps the investigator who put the term science diplomacy, vetenskapsdiplomati, on the map in Sweden in 2017 and 2018. So I would like to ask each of the panelists to give us their view of the report, of the way the Swedish situation is portrayed, and perhaps also of the future. So please go ahead, Agneta.
Thank you very much. I just have to stress that I just represent myself, not the internationalization report, because that is delivered to the government several years ago. I see a great benefit with this report and the lifting of science diplomacy in the Swedish concept or in the Swedish agenda. And the reason for this is not actually that other countries in Europe or the world are dealing with this concept. I think the main reason is that in this country there has in the last years been a tendency to very negative attitudes towards non-democratic countries. And that is also embraced by the academic society. So it's not okay to collaborate with researchers in non-democratic countries, especially some of them, where the Swedish attitudes are very, very hostile. You can take China, for instance. But having said that, I think just that we have these attitudes in our country, it's very important to stress science diplomacy, because we have to meet each other, and it has to be okay to collaborate with scientists with a good knowledge base in other countries, the non-democratic as well. So that's why I think it's very beneficial to have this report just now.
Thank you very much, Agneta. And there are many points here we can come back to, but I think it's good with the first sort of brief round. Astrid, would you like to give us your introductory comments?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I would like to stress the great importance of this green paper being made right now and being launched. And I think it's really, STINT is to congratulate having taken this initiative. And I also think that another very important aspect with the green paper is that it is produced by so prominent international scholars who are really leading in their field. Of course, this has also a certain disadvantage, as their knowledge of the national context is necessarily not as deep as if STINT would have chosen a Swede. But and there are thus many smaller initiatives that are not being covered in the green paper. But I still think that the advantage is much greater because we get this important perspective from the outside. And I must say that I very much agree with their broad overall picture of the Swedish context. And I also very much like the open approach and the fact that you argue that the fuzzy concept is really an advantage. that you define science diplomacy as a boundary object and talk about the productive tension between science and diplomacy, and also the importance of literacy in both fields. So then, why is it then so important? Well, I very much would agree with Agneta. We did talk before, but I'd already been noting, because as university rector during the past few years, to an increasing degree, we have been approached as from very different actors, spanning from embassies to authorities and advisors of different kinds, and told to avoid or at least be cautious about certain countries. And I think this is an extremely dangerous development. Science, by definition, as well as technology and innovation, they are international, and there must be an exchange, an international exchange. It's the very DNA of science. So therefore I think that it is now, it's really the time to not only do science diplomacy in practice, implicitly, as you call it in the report, but also really to develop Swedish science diplomacy discourse.
Thank you very much, Astrid, and also thank you for bringing in the perspective. As you said, as the rector of one of the largest Swedish universities, I think you're dealing with a lot of these tensions that are becoming visible today. We're very happy also to have the chief analyst from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Jose Hagman, because as we said, it's all about the link between diplomacy and science. So Jose, would you like to give us your view?
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for having me. This is highly relevant. I have a few more structured remarks. First of all, when we talk about science and diplomacy, we do not have a foreign policy about this, as the report so clearly states. We probably should have, we do not. So my views are my own, not from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, although I very much would like to have had it the other way around. It has not become a mainstream subject in Sweden, not yet at least. Yes, this is uncharted territory, but we're not starting from scratch. There is a lot of knowledge out there. It's in different silos, or whatever you want to call it. We do have the innovation counselors from the Ministry of Enterprise who are pushing these issues. We have Business Sweden. We have Chambers of Commerce. However, fundamentally, we do not have a tradition, nor do we have structures for strategic coordination of research and development. We do not have that at the government level. We do not have it at the agency level or the academic level. We also have issues within all state sectors, academia included, of painfully rigid and watertight stovepipes, of turf battles, of tradition, fear of the new, and the not invented here syndrome. And few dare to talk about what technology, what science is critical, what is must-have, not just what is nice to have. We do not have that sense of urgency, at least not formally in this country. And it is a fact that both agencies and ministries compete, and both agencies and ministries are by nature cautious. And I think this is a fundamental challenge in the bureaucratic DNA today. And I don't think it's good for Swedish long-term competitiveness. But do not forget that science, many would argue that is a means in itself. But no, science, and we're using tax money here. It's the hard-earned money from taxpayers. It is here to develop growth, to develop jobs, to develop, to deliver the things which we want, which is security, it is healthcare, it is education, it's infrastructure, etc. So the science is there to develop and lead to innovation, which leads to something better and makes us more competitive. It's not just a nice to have. Organic and ad hoc is great for a talk shop, excuse me, but interaction spaces or the clearinghouses, and it's great for those involved. And if we have a large organization such as that, it will be very nice to have. And everybody will have a nice feel-good factor afterwards. I believe that if we want true impact, there needs to be an element of top-down. You need a number of ministers who say that, this is important. Yes, there are some technologies which are must-have for this country, for our jobs. And just as my colleague from Ericsson mentioned, I mean, what is the direction? Do we have a leading star somewhere? I would argue that, yes, we do need ministers, and especially maybe a prime minister as well, who from her office, if we have a she, can give a guidance and act as a coordinating mechanism, not just with enlightened politicians, because it is a challenge that very few politicians and members of parliament or civil servants are scientists. None of us in the bureaucracy, or very few of us, are engineers or programmers or biologists. And that is a fundamental problem which we have. So I do believe that we do need an element of top-down. We do need to have a sense of priorities. We need a blunt discussion of what we in Sweden are really good at. And that goes both for business and for universities. I think STINT can provide a valuable contribution here, preferably with input from strategic business. What are Swedish universities and business really good at? How focused and coordinated is academia? Do we have critical mass in certain areas of science and technology? What are our neighbors really good at? We do not ask these questions. Yes, we have some rankings we can look at, but do we really have a deep study of this? I think we need that, and we need to be critical and quite open about our own fragilities, flaws, and strengths, and be quite proud of them. Where do we have critical mass in Sweden? And what is really important, not least for the business community, who needs the scientists and needs the R&D. And to be quite honest, within public sector, we just cost money. We need a strong competitive business environment to produce money so that we live, to be quite honest. So in Scandinavia, who is on the cutting edge? And long-term wise, will we need to talk about a division of labor? Because quite honestly, we are essentially one market. Our biggest trading partners, it's Germany, it's Norway, and then Finland and Denmark and the UK and so forth. But maybe we should see this as a global community, not just, or a regional community rather, in order to compete globally. And finally, let me just say about the discussion we have on China. I think it's absolutely essential that we work with, we should work closest with our like-minded countries because we have the same kind of values and interests. It's easiest. So when we talk about division of labor, yes, absolutely, it is the Nordic countries very much. And our Prime Minister in her latest speech in the Parliament was very clear about the Nordic element of the cooperation. But we should also work with the best. And the best in most accounts are in the US and they are in China. It is Silicon Valley, it is Shenzhen, it is Boston we need to work with and be inspired by and tag on and maybe even copy what they're really good at. And do not forget that China today represents 45.7% of all patent applications in the world. The US is down from 19.2% to 18.2%. So China is a leader when it comes to very many of the technologies. And yes, we do not share the values of the Middle Kingdom. Definitely not. And it's hugely problematic in very many areas. Hey, I come from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is what I do on a daily basis. It is problematic, but we do need to work with them. We need, for example, China on board on managing climate change, for example, on space, on oceans, on the global connectivity. We need China on board there. If they export bad technology to, for example, Africa, it is our headache. And yes, we will see huge challenges from climate change. So we should work with China. And if we only work with countries which are super democratic, well, there are only 3 countries which are more democratic than Sweden. It's Norway, it's New Zealand, it's Finland. And that's it. So yes, we do have to work with other countries that are less democratic than Sweden. Suck it up. And yes, that does not mean that we should be naive. Definitely not. But there is other technology out there, and we need to be focused, and we need to look at this from the very top down as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose. I think this has added a lot of flavor to the debate, and I think we have seen different dimensions of why one needs to work with different countries. And thank you also for bringing in the issue of technology sovereignty, which is something of what you're talking about implicitly, which is a very present topic right now at the EU level. And something I think, at least whether we like it or not, we cannot ignore, because it is shaping a lot of the debate right now. I know Agneta wants to come in, but I would like to let Beate give her opening statement, please.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here from the Ministry of Education and Research. And I truly appreciated reading your report. And for sure, and indeed, there is a currently renewed interest in science diplomacy. And we are all gathered here today. That's a fine example on why we need to discuss science diplomacy. The topic or the activities, the topic is maybe new, but the activities are surely not. You were using a definition from 2020, but I mean, activities has been going on, not least in Sweden, throughout the post-war period. So I think it's interesting that we're using the fuzzy character of science diplomacy and trying to grasp what this could mean today. And as we all have seen during the challenges, not at least during the pandemic, but we see the tensions, the geopolitical tensions. That has all shown us that international collaboration in research and innovation is more urgent than ever. And I really appreciate that science diplomacy is now taking part in a broader discussion about responsible internationalization. I think that's necessary. And responsible internationalization includes technological sovereignty, includes security, includes openness, of course. And I think science diplomacy there is really important because we need excellent and we need open science to conquer the global crisis that we are experiencing now. And science stands in clear contrast to ideology-driven thinking, disinformation, and infodemics. And this is why we need science. And when policy is guided by science and evidence-based fact, trust in political decisions can be enhanced. And this is the truly fundamentals of a democratic society and humanity worldwide. So just a few words about science diplomacy activities in Sweden. For example, we have our bilateral agreements where research and innovation, of course, constitutes a main area of cooperation. Or is part of an agreement of cooperation in other areas. And like Lena told us, we have 7 offices of science and innovation. And we have our counselors of research and space affairs in Brussels. They are all existing infrastructures, and they are aimed at supporting science diplomacy in Sweden, even though the term is not explicitly used. And I also want to add that we just have tasked 4 Swedish councils and authorities to establish a platform for internationalization, where actually a science diplomacy is part of their work. So I'm really looking forward to that platform and what they can, how they can feed into this broader discussion on science diplomacy as part of the broader picture of strategic internationalization or responsible internationalization. So I really appreciate this fuzzy character of the concept. And I think it's interesting how that leads to implicit science diplomacy practices. And just a few words about time and space here, because I have also noticed a broader interest from the history of science, doing research on how science diplomacy activities has been done throughout the years. And I think that is also something that we could learn from when we are now looking ahead and forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've gotten a lot of food for thought and for further rounds of iteration. And I hope it's triggered also interest in the audience. What I take from this first round is, I think a notion, very many interesting things have been said. I think one of the things, if I may say, and hear if you agree, is that all of you agree on that we have a changing international environment. I also take away from what you all are saying is that Sweden has a tradition of openness and collaboration, which seems to be important or considered a fundamental issue for Sweden, both for competitiveness, but also for science. But then there also seems, and then also I think a lot of you, or I think Jose talked about perhaps the silos that we see, and I think the point you made about Sweden perhaps not having a very strong tradition of scientists in policy making, I think is a very interesting component. Comes back to Evart's point about being literate in both science and technology and diplomacy. So I'd like to hear if you have any reflections on that. And then perhaps maybe the question I hear coming out of this is, I think we all agree, as we said, that we have a rather distributed, implicit form of science diplomacy in Sweden, and it has served Sweden rather well. And I guess perhaps where I sense a little bit of disagreement is whether we can maintain or should maintain this in the future, given the changing international environment. This is my attempt to sort of bring together what I've heard. So I would like to, and maybe before I let in the audience, I think this is really interesting because Stefan, you mentioned that there are other countries, for example, Austria, that has a diplomatic academy, which trains diplomats, right? Among other things in science diplomacy. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And are there many countries where you see similar things?
Not the same, but similar. But what I was referring to, that's one thing, how science diplomacy is dealt with, and then linked to science, and then some science diplomatic efforts result from that. I think, by the way, Elke might be better even to speak about the Austrian experience in that respect. I was referring to strategic intelligence and how that is organized, not necessarily for science diplomacy. To give one example from the country we come from, in the Netherlands, you have, for instance, the Rathenau Institute, with this science system department providing the government, the parliament, the publics with information about strengths and weaknesses of Dutch science, technology, and innovation. Same holds for in the Netherlands, also the advisory board on science, technology, innovation. It's an independent agency. Both facilitate the debate in the Netherlands across the range of actors on science policy, technology, innovation policy, fueled with what we would call strategic intelligence. That means systematic information, strengths, weaknesses, investments, what have you, and competition, what you were talking about, where do we stand? And that's the reason why I would think something like that could be very helpful, also for stronger government initiatives, top-down even, as you suggested, if one would have related information not in a very discrete and very separated form, but is something that is being debated within the whole forum, so that one can say, yeah, there is a need. We see a chance to go to that direction, that direction. That can be then proactively picked up. So my plea is not to make sure that there is well-organized and trustable, reliable strategic intelligence about strengths, weaknesses, so that you can position within that respective strategic initiatives, whether by the government or the individual actors, whether with respect to diplomatic perspectives, then we are back to science diplomacy also, or just investments in the field of science innovation domestically, that would be related to each other.
Thank you very much. So I would like to, also I just wanted to mention, I think Beate made a very good point. As we all agree, it's nothing new, science diplomacy, right? And I think precisely in these times, it becomes even more relevant to look at history. So I think that is a very, and then perhaps what I also hear in this panel is potentially an implicit tension between research and innovation, where innovation sometimes is very much about competitiveness, about value creation to a country or to a region, whereas research perhaps combines individual curiosity with a thirst to know for the sake of knowing. So these are the interesting things that are coming out of this discussion too. So if you would like to respond, and Agneta had raised her hand.
Yes, thank you. Even though we are here united in several respects when it comes to the importance of collaborating with all types of countries, sticking to good ethical norms, as you were talking about, national security and responsible internationalization, which STINT has put forward very much. It is very important. And I think we all are aware of that individual scientists in different parts of the Swedish system has played a role, even towards the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Even though they are not organizations, they are individuals that are going there. And I'm sure the rector is not aware of which are those individuals in your universities, because universities are, as you were saying, places where a lot of people are very diverse, and that it's including fundamental research as well as applied research. And I have to react when you are saying that science is just for growth. Science is also for a long-term knowledge. I just stepped down for being chair of the Swedish Research Council, and that is an organization supporting fundamental research. And we need that. We need to not to know, but we need people in this country, together with other researchers in other countries, doing research on issues that you cannot imagine today. That is one thing that is important. I want you to notice that. We need that in this country. Noted. Good. The other thing is, you said that we have to collaborate with the best. Yes. But do anybody of us know which are the best in 20 years? Mm. So we have to discover other parts of the world, except the Americas and Asia, as you have been pointing out. Perhaps also Africa, Latin America, and so on. So I think the collaboration from Swedish scientists have to cover a broader area in the world than just the best of today. Another interesting thing is the top-down approach that you put forward here, and the bottom-up from the report. You have, in a way, discovered the soul of the Swedish academic society without having been studying that for so much time. We have a lot of silos, yes, but we are very fragmented, as you say it. And in such a world, having a top-down doesn't work in the universities. We know that from the beginning. You can try, and it's good if you have an office close to the Prime Minister or something. But I think as Beate, as the new platform for internationalization, perhaps couldn't be that new forum, but it could take the initiative for a broader forum, including others than those agencies and universities that are members today. So that is a good point, and you can pick up the recommendations from the report. I also want to stress that not just individuals in the Swedish system are there active in one way or the other, but there are organizations more or less connected to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that is, they are active in this. You have the Institute for International Affairs, you have CIPRI, you have also this little Institute for Security and Development Policy, which are connecting people from different countries in their so-called research internships. I happen to know a little about it, and I know you do as well. But this organization, I don't think many of you know anything about that organization. And I can understand that you haven't noted it, because those people you have interviewed are not aware of this organization. It's quite unknown. But it is an organization that does things you can call science diplomacy. And building on that, and building on all the individuals in the academia and the innovation industry, I think we can go forward and sticking to ethical rules and security concerns, doing a lot more than we are doing today.
Thank you, Agneta. I would like to ask the other panel members if they want to react to the things that have been said, and also ask the audience to prepare their questions or comments. Go ahead, Astrid.
Well, just a few short remarks. I would argue that in practice, at any university, there is a daily practice of a kind of science diplomacy, perhaps not with a very, very high degree of awareness of what the researchers are actually doing, or at least with another primary purpose than that of doing diplomacy. It is rather about advancing science, but it also entails bringing together scientists from countries which do not collaborate or are supposed not to be able to collaborate. And I think that's an extremely important aspect of the practice. Let me just mention two examples to be a little more concrete. First of all, of course, in working with difficult countries, trying to maintain and develop research and higher education exchanges. And secondly, building the European University Alliances, where both bridging the regional gaps within Europe, but also, not least, in reaching out globally. For example, the alliance where Stockholm University is member, CIVIS, includes a number of African associated partners. So that is really a way of doing diplomacy in practice. I also would like to say that I have absolutely nothing against the top-down perspective as well. I think it would be great if we had a Minister for Foreign Affairs who was really engaged in science diplomacy and took the lead. But I still really object to the view that a forum, a non-partisan forum, would only be a talking club. What is diplomacy, after all, than to do talking and to advance things through talking? So I think that really to coordinate and to try to make the very fragmented landscape, bring it together in a way, I think that is an extremely important task.
Thank you, Astrid. Jose.
What we need is more. We need output. I have no problems with a talk shop if it delivers. And it's the thing that I want it to deliver. I want us to be more competitive. I want us to have more science. I want that to permeate very much more of our political life, of our diplomatic life, because science and technology will fundamentally change, our societies, the way we interact, the way we learn, the way we govern, the way we communicate, the way we love everything. It will change warfare. It will change health. It will change all elements of our life. And I want us to be on the cutting edge even tomorrow. We've had a fantastic ride in Sweden from 1870 to 1970, where our GDP per capita was 2.5 times the European average. Fantastic. And we're playing way above our league for being a small country, which is a third of Jakarta, or half of Mumbai. So it's a fantastic situation, but I just want us to remain competitive and to be hungry, and also to, yes, have a sense of urgency, that not resting on our laurels, and we have a fantastic starting point. But I am concerned that other countries are doing more, are being very focused, and are looking at technologies which we are not, and daring to be more. I'm not saying it'll be 100% top down. Of course it'll not. We're Sweden, my God's sake. Of course it will not. And yes, I think your proposal is probably realistic. That's maybe what we can do. But we should strive to be more enlightened and to maybe be open. Say that, okay, what areas are Sweden really, really good at? And what areas should we say that, okay, our neighbors should be focusing more on? And yes, if you want to study quantum computing, well, go to Copenhagen then, or whatever. But a bit of division of labor, because we are really, really small. And I think that sense of realism, that I want us to be competitive in 10, 20, 30, 40 years' time. That is the objective. And how we do that, how we can mobilize that, I think is the key question here. So this is a good effort. And no, I'm not naive when it comes to China and things like that. And of course we have our standards and norms. Of course we do. And we shouldn't give them up. But yes, we work with the best. And whoever has major investments in education, in R&D, in higher education, we can see, I mean, if you invest today, you have output in a generation's time. So whoever's investing today, fine. We should work with those. I think those numbers are very clear. It's the United States and China, but that's another issue. But if you find other projects, my God, we should work with the best and the brightest, and we should be flexible and not just get stuck in our old ways just because we've had a cooperation since the 17th century.
Thank you, Jose. And it's funny because I actually hear more similarities than differences. I hear a hunger and a willingness to change, and also, as Agneta said, maintaining this explorative sense, so not taking anything for granted, looking ahead to possibilities where they might not be that visible today. Beate.
Yes, thank you. I want to go back to your question, Silvia, about the tension, or possible tension between research and innovation. Yes. And maybe we could also dare to look a little bit upon, maybe there's not a tension, but differences between the role of science and the role of diplomacy. And you mentioned also the scientific freedom, and from the perspective, the scientific perspective, we have core scientific values, research integrity, research ethics, and so on. And when science and diplomacy are combined, I think we have to also take those core values into consideration. And I'm not as a strong proponent of the top-down perspective, I would say. Working at the Ministry of Education and Research, of course, we know the importance of not just the bottom-up, but also the in-between aspects. I mean, the government agencies and so on. But I think what we need with science diplomacy are more democratic and sustainable societies. And that can be through innovation or through scientific results, but I think that's what we need to safeguard here. And in that case, academic freedom and freedom of science and the core scientific values are really important here if we want to really gain the best parts of science diplomacy.
Thank you very much. I think excellent points, and I think it ties a little bit into the question about momentum, because we might be also dealing with different speeds of how we view things and how we think things need to be when things need to be tackled, and how can we combine. I would like to open up the floor for comments or questions. Andreas, go ahead.
Yes, I have a couple of questions coming in on the online chat, and first it's from Basil Mahfouz, Dr. Hagman discussed influence of international politics on science collaboration. Can science diplomacy improve relations between hostile countries and reduce tension? Are there any examples of this? Maybe to Dr. Hagman first.
Well, thank you very much. And this relates a bit to what Beata just said here, that absolutely it is an impact in international relations, and it can help, that we need something to work with. Just take China as an example, which is hugely problematic in very, very many areas. But yes, we need something to work with. We have, for example, a dual policy vis-a-vis Russia. We have huge issues with Russia, but we still maintain a dialogue with them. And when it comes to solving bigger issues, look at climate change, for example, or long-term issues, yes, we need to work with most people, and we need channels of dialogue. And I do see science as an element of this. And it is also a way to, I shouldn't say project norms, I don't believe in that, but if we manage to deal with science in an open and transparent way, and it works for us, well, maybe other countries will say that, well, it works for Sweden, maybe that's something to emulate and copy. So it's in an indirect way of projecting norms, standards, democracy, transparency, etc. The good stuff.
Thank you.
And I have another one from Albin Gaunt. How to deal with information asymmetry in relation to new and future strong science nodes. Researchers in university need better information about partners in other countries in order to build mutual trust. Their knowledge about us is more substantial than our knowledge about them.
I think this is a very interesting point, and I don't know who would like to pick it up, but if I also may say, as somebody who's also been in the management of a university, you know, I think Swedish universities are, of course, the embodiment of knowledge, many forms of knowledge, but sometimes we don't really have this kind of knowledge about different environments or different cultures, research cultures or scientific norms in all the disciplines. Would anybody, yeah?
Yeah, we really need more about that. And I know that STINT has a lot of country reports and others, and I appreciate if STINT will continue with that. I don't know what that kind of platform we are talking about, just established, might initiate that kind of studies as well. But for God's sake, do it from the STINT point of view.
Yeah, and thank you. And it ties also, I have another question. It ties also on what you were saying, Stefan, about this whole idea of distributed but joint strategic intelligence.
Exactly.
Did you have more, Andreas? Because otherwise we have a question here in the... Okay, so let's take in the audience, please.
Thank you for an interesting discussion. As I see it, the sector and this system is contains, as I see it, 4 different layers, where you would have the government as the very top, and then you would have the agencies, and then I would say as Agneta mentioned, the universities simply speaking, it could be divided into 2 layers. You would have the university management, and then you would have the actual researchers. And I think it's important to recognize that all these actors, they are driven by different things. And I think that there could definitely be synergies to work from a systematic perspective. I think a top-down perspective could be good, but also a bottom-up. I think putting the normative things aside and just looking at the functional side, I think it's important to recognize that you have all these layers. I mean, if you, from the foreign ministry, want to achieve good relations with a country, to strive for peace, using researchers as a tool could be a good measure. However, researchers are not going to build up new research networks thinking that they would be a diplomatic tool. They would be driven by other things. And the same goes for university management. I mean, as universities are constructed in Sweden, you could have all the rectors in Sweden engaged to build up a relationship and have good dialogue with the foreign ministry. But it would be rather difficult to engage researchers and find tools to create these networks. So my point is that in this dialogue, it is important to just recognize that you have all these 4 layers, that they are driven by different things. It could be a disadvantage and it could be an advantage. The important thing is to acknowledge these differences and strive to find common ground where all these actors work together, and also actors involved to know that I'm collaborating with actors at different layers, and they might not have the same rationales as I do, and that they are aware of that. I think in that way it becomes easier to stipulate ways to work jointly together. Thank you.
Thank you. Very relevant point. I would like to gather a few. I have one here and then one in the back. Oh, great. So we'll gather 4 and then we'll have the panel reflect. So, Verdi.
And I get to start. That's great. I wanted to touch back on this eventual competition between research and innovation, because I think we have to go back to why do we need to have international collaborations? It's in order for us to learn something. And for us, from the Offices of Science and Innovation, we're always looking for what can we as equal partners, according to, again, the 2030, learn from each other? Where does the collaboration between countries actually gives additional effect? And I think that's also important when we're talking about internationalization and innovation, that they all can exist in the same space, and they are all independent of each other. Like, it's not linear, but circular. It's an iterative thing. So I was wondering, is there a need to actually, I mean, it's mostly a comment, not a question. I'm sorry for being so male. No, but what I wanted to say was, I think it's important to also, in these spaces, to have a shift that when we collaborate with different countries, democratic or non-democratic, you're right, we need to have the norms, we need to have the agenda, but we also have to see what's in it for us when we collaborate. And I think that's an important aspect in science diplomacy and in innovation diplomacy at the same. So I think that's also a way to find the boundaries of science diplomacy, like what does Sweden need to learn? Because we are playing above our grade, but we still have a lot of countries. We have Brazil, India, China, United States, Korea, Japan, UK, actually prioritizing bilateral collaborations with us. Even though we're so small, we still have something to give. And I think in order for us to keep that, we also need to learn from those collaborations and do the most of them.
Thank you, Lena. Maria in the back, and then Carl, and then did I miss somebody else in there?
Hi, I'm Maria Vilenius. I used to work with Agneta Blad on the Inquiry in Internationalization, now at Stockholm University. I would like to bring up a suggestion we had in the inquiry on the offices of science and innovation, which was to enlarge them, to put more resources, which in a sense would be more of a top-down way to move, to put more boots on the ground, as you mentioned. And we were also discussing how the ties to the universities could be strengthened through these offices in different countries. And it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Carl.
Thanks very much. This is not so much a question as a reflection that it might be useful to separate the forms of science diplomacy from its objectives or directive. I mean, Sweden has a clear set of objectives on human rights and on trade and on sustainability, but when it comes to science diplomacy, no one knows. And you can, of course, have very bottom-up distributed forms of executing science diplomacy. But if no one knows what is nationally or governmentally set objectives, that, I would say, isn't diplomacy, it's science.
Thank you very much. I think that ties together very nicely some of the comments, because I think you put your finger on something which, as somebody who's worked in also in different areas, there are, as Jose said, there are sometimes frictions between different policy areas. And it doesn't always make it easy for universities to know, they are put under pressure either for collaborating or not collaborating. So I think that, and then I guess it always comes back to me, to this notion, as you also said, we have different motivations and different drivers, but where do these meet in a sensible and intellectual conversation, so that we can recognize where we can do things together and perhaps where not. So, is there anything more important from the chat, Andreas, that you wanted to bring in before I let the panel reflect?
It's again a question from Albin Gaunt, and I think it's relevant here what has been said. How should we design a multi-level dialogue on values with countries that do not define academic freedom, human rights, etc., the way we do? Especially, what is the role of STEM subjects here?
Thank you very much. So I'd like and we're going to start with Beate this time. So for a final round, and I would also like to include Stefan in that, please. So go ahead, Beate.
Thank you. Well, when it comes to the multi-level dialogue, again, I think it's important to address those levels. I think, I'm not sure who of you, that it's not only a dialogue between nations or countries. It depends on this the levels. So I'm not sure if I'm able to answer Albin's questions straight ahead. And when it comes to the role of STEM subjects, I think again it's not an easy question to answer, and I think maybe that's also more of a question to address to the universities, I would say. But actually, if I may, when I've been brought up the STEM subjects, I was also thinking about the humanities and social sciences here. We tend to talk a lot about technology and medicine and hard science, but I think it would also be interesting to and I'm hijacking Albin's question there, to include the role of the humanities and social sciences here. So I apologize to Albin because I don't think I answered the question, but I think that's also something that really shows the importance that we continue this discussion and continue it between different levels, different ministries, different departments at different ministries, and also between, a broad perspectives on the stakeholders here. And I really, really want to stress that we need to discuss the objectives of science diplomacy. I think that's a core issue here, to understand why we need science diplomacy and how we can strengthen science diplomacy.
Thank you very much. Jose.
Thank you. International cooperation, it has to add value. And I think we have to be a bit picky there. It's a pretty big world out there. It's 7.9 billion people these days. And there are a few other universities apart from Uppsala and Lund, although I hate to admit it. But we need to be picky on who we work with, because we are very small and the world is very big, so we have to be choosy. We can definitely have an altruistic element of it, of being open and generous and so forth. But at the core, we need to start to focus also on our own needs. It's not a bad word to talk about interests. It's not a bad word to talk about what is important for Sweden. And it is, after all, it is taxes we are using, and we need to use with great care. We've all worked hard for that money. It does need to deliver, either in the near term or in the very long term. Apropos vetenskapsrådet. It needs to deliver national harmony. I know it sounds like a communist slogan, but that is essentially what we're talking about. The country has to function, has to work. There has to be trust. We need healthcare which works. We need jobs. We need growth. We need innovation. That is what this is aimed to deliver, directly or indirectly. And it is actually a case of our long-term survival. And I would say it is the very fundamental and most important element of our society is education, and it is science. And that needs to permeate the whole of society, and we make an argument. And therefore, I would welcome more lobbying, more articles in newspapers saying why this is important. I think STINT has a role to play here. And do expose which countries have the best practices, the best systems. Who should we learn from? I mean, only idiots never change their mind. And yes, there is room for improvement for Sweden. And I do believe in a brighter future. But a little bit of revolution, I think, is not a bad thing. Coming from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose. Astrid.
You strongly evoked the Swedish perspective, which of course is quite natural, and it comes naturally to mind. But as representative of the universities, I would rather say that our mission is rather global. We have to tackle, and also of course Sweden as a country has, but the universities are there to tackle, for example, grand global challenges and wicked problems. And this means that we have to put aside the rivalry, as is mentioned in the report with reference to Ulrich Beck. And we have to try to cooperate between and with our very different perspectives and priorities. I agree about the levels, but I'm not sure they are always. Of course, the government is above it all, but agencies, universities, and so on, they are rather different fields within Sweden where we have to collaborate across. And of course, there is a potential tension between university leadership and the researchers, but according to my experience, researchers, they may hate to be used as tools, but I don't think that if they become aware of the importance of science diplomacy, I know that very many researchers can also embrace that dimension of their activities, and I think that is something very important to use here. The platform has been mentioned several times. There are only 3 representatives of higher education institutions within the platform. And so to be efficient from our side, the universities really have to do their homework. We have to increase the collaboration between universities and within universities. STEM was mentioned. I think that STEM has a very important role to play in science diplomacy, and it's sometimes, though not always, I'm sure, easier to meet on common ground discussing STEM. It's much more difficult with those soft sciences like humanities and social sciences. So these were just a few remarks.
Thank you very much, Astrid. Agneta and then Stefan.
Yeah. I passed something initially to Stefan, and that is we have been talking about science and innovation, but we have not been talking that much about organizations, different kinds as such, as you are mentioning in the report, and individuals, because universities are full of individuals. So I want you to comment about that in some way. But my last statement is that it is all about trust. Trust between researchers when they collaborate. Trust in diplomacy in order to achieve something. And we must not forget that. And you build trust not just quickly. You build it in a long-term collaboration. So it's not so easy to make this being planned. You have to grip the opportunities. There might be a researcher somewhere in some discipline at one of our universities having a good collaboration that is ethical and not securely for this nation. And you might need that person in your diplomacy work. and having those connections. If we talk that science diplomacy is okay to deal with, perhaps you will be connected much more in the future than today. So keep in mind, trust.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time. Stefan, please, go ahead.
Yeah, trust. I mean, the main reason, that's also in the presentation at the end, I mentioned the word trust, why we suggested not only to set up this forum, curated forum, which can have a relationship with the platform idea that is already there, and the role of strategic intelligence there, because that helps to build, first of all, to deliberate, to become knowledgeable about diverse and often even competing worldviews, and that if we accept that those exist, then this is the first step towards setting up some trust. Therefore, I think the suggestion, last remark here, that we have made with this curated forum, whatever concrete shape that will take, it can clearly become more than a talk club. It can, but of course there's a risk of simply staying a boring talk club, of course. But if you combine it with this deliberation element, of this explorative element, where do we stand in a global context, into different areas, then you can use that also as a platform or as a forum, as a starting base, to put it like that, for developing strategic initiatives. Across a range of things. I mean, it can be governmental initiatives, it can be training initiatives for individual researchers in their respective university. It can be so many different things if one simply is able to deliberate about and determine what strengths and weaknesses, needs are, by the way, not only Swedish needs, but vis-a-vis and in the context of global challenges. I think that's an important thing that should never forget about. But it can be done if one wants to set up such a forum in a deliberate and way, feed it also with the means that are necessary for that purpose. They don't have the time. I always think of the history of the framework programs of the European Commission. I've been involved in evaluation of the very first ones already in the late 1980s, early 1990s. What has happened in that area of collaboration across innovation, research, networks, career development, and my own career development coming from one country to the other, and so that holds for many of us, was 50 years ago not got to think about it. But it was fostered by a strategic initiative that was supported by not only the Commission but the important member states at the time. It's another story, but it comes to my mind when I think of platforms and starting not platforms, fora, or starting points, creating starting points for interaction and deliberation, and from there taking also strategic initiatives.
Thank you so much. I usually pride myself in finishing on time. We're 1 minute and 40 seconds late, but I think I can blame that on the fact that I don't think we could have had such a conversation online. I think this was a fantastic panel discussion. I want to thank also the online audience for participating. And I just want to sum it up. I think you made an important point, Jose. I think technology is changing our world in a way that it exceeds our imagination. And technology, combined with rivalry between fundamentally different political systems, is creating a very complicated situation for us to relate to. I also really think that trust, as you said, Agneta, is something that Sweden has. It's documented. It's something that Sweden is strong in. But I think maybe we're getting to a point where we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to use it even better, given the changing situation? And finally, I think it's come down to a really fundamental discussion as an economic historian, which I find fascinating. It's really this view of Hobbesian or Rousseauian state of nature, but also about history, whether we are advancing or whether we're just spinning. So with that, I just want to thank you all, and I've found it incredibly stimulating. And thank you so much to the authors, to Stefan and to Evert, for providing us with a timely input into what I think we all think is a very relevant conversation. Thank you. Va? Eller hur? Ja. Roligt.